Signore e signori, buon pomeriggio. Welcome to New York University Casa Italiana Zerilli Marimò for the second installment of the series Love and Letters in the Renaissance, conceived by Ida Caiazza, who's the Marie Curie Fellow here at New York University. We are delighted that Ida is using the resources, her energy, her knowledge to put together this series that has the specific purpose of opening the doors and the windows of academia to the general public, to people like you who are interested in learning more about the Renaissance, about epistolaries, about emotions. And today we have the fortune of having two scholars, and one in particular. Ida will do the official presentation, but allow me to give a personal welcome back to Professor Paola Ugolini. She was a graduate student here at New York University. We couldn't be more proud of her achievement. Yes, please. It's a great joy for all of us when one of our graduate students moves out after the PhD, gets an important job, and like Paola, is producing fantastic material in her field of studies. And so it's bentornata a casa, professoressa. It's a great pleasure to see how far you have gone after you have left this place. And as you know, this is only one part of the series that is very complex in its formulation. You find all the information on our website if you want to know the upcoming events. And now I would like to ask Dr. Ida Caiazza to come to the podium to present briefly the purpose of the evening, of the afternoon. You know, it's a double lecture, it's a double bill that we're having. Paola is with Marco, and the official presentation will be by Ida. And maybe you're going to remind us of the next appointment in the series. Thank you again very much for being here with us today.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ida Caiazza. I'm a Marie Curie Global Fellow here at NYU and at the University of Oslo. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here again at the second meeting of our series, Love and Letters in the Renaissance. To those of you who were here with us on the 9th of September too, I am delighted to see you again. And of course, I am also very happy to see new faces. So welcome everybody here and online too. Thank you so much for keeping up the good work and devoting the beginning of your weekend to our lovely Renaissance women. Already for the second time, and as Stefano said, we have a third upcoming event next Friday, and then we'll have some rest, but not for long, right, Stefano? Yeah, so as I said, this is the second event of the series. Love and Letters in the Renaissance is the result of a collaboration between the wonderful staff of Casa Italiana, the Department of Italian at NYU, and my Marie Curie program. So let me thank again for the Casa, Stefano Albertini, Julian Sachs, Kostya Kostic, and Chiara Basso. For the department, Eugenio Refini, Julie Canziani, Esme De Coster, and Giulia, the student who's going to help us today. And for my Marie Curie program, Virginia Cox, Falkite, and Giovanni Tarantino. It's extraordinary how many people there are behind a simple couple of hours, right? So, yeah, 2 weeks ago we had, as Stefano said, the opening event of the series, which was also the opening event of the Casa season, and also the first one after COVID, so we were particularly happy about it, especially Stefano. Our speakers were Professor Lina Bolzoni, who's here with us again, and Jane Tylus of Yale University, and they introduced us to the love letters written by Maria Savorgnan to Pietro Bembo, which is going to be the fil rouge of our events and also of our digital humanities project we will present on next Friday. If you couldn't make it 2 weeks ago, but you'd like to watch Bolzoni's and Tylus's speeches, they are already available in the Casa Italiana website. Just select Multimedia and Video Archive, as you see here in the slide. And if you're curious about the Marie Curie program, maybe my research, or you want to know more about the Digital Humanities project I mentioned, I see this especially to students, you can watch the first 10 minutes of this recording. And of course, you are very welcome to join the workshop next Friday, and also to attend the Marie Curie event we are organizing for next month on October the 20th. Okay, so given this context, let's start to savor the banquet we have prepared for you today, which is rich and delicious indeed, as we'll have a double lecture followed by a Q&A session open both to the in-presence and to the online audience. So if you are attending online and would like to ask a question or share a comment, please write it in the chat, and Stefano, right, will read it to us. I am particularly proud of this double lecture because thanks to Paola Ugolini and Marco Faini, we will frame the case study of Maria Savorgnan we saw with Bolzoni and Tylus in a broader context, and we will address the fascinating topic of Renaissance women and love in two complementary ways. With Paola Ugolini, we will consider women per se, which is a hot topic in Renaissance studies. And we have seen with Bolzoni and Tylus last time how being a woman could influence a person's life in ways that are sometimes difficult to imagine for us today. A lady in the audience shared she found striking that Maria's husband, even after passing away, could control his wife's life through the provision in his last will, where he decides that she shall remain chaste forever. And so she must have a guardian in her own house. Or also I found remarkable that Bembo cannot control Maria's life, but does try to control her image, her literary representation. As Bolzoni said, he tries to manipulate her fantasma amoroso. So he has a fantasy of appropriation. He manipulates her for the sake of his own image and self-fashioning, which is even more remarkable if we think that in Renaissance Italy, the use of one's image was a very important means of communication. We all know Greenblatt's concept of self-fashioning. But apart from Bembo and Savorgnan's specific case, in early modern Europe, there was, as Paola will say in more depth and detail, there was a debate called Querelle des Femmes, a wide and intense discussion about women and their role in society. And many extraordinary women took part in this debate. Many challenged the traditional view of women, and many used cleverly the means that they could resort to speak their mind and make their voice heard. On the other hand, as Paola will say, in 1976, the scholar John Kelly wrote a provoking essay called "Did Women Have a Renaissance?", arguing that in the early modern period, which is supposed to be a moment of advancement for the Western civilization, women's power and agency actually declined instead of being enhanced. So Kelly advocates that the Renaissance was such only for the privileged male, not for society in general. And Eugenio Garen, too, in his book La cultura del Rinascimento, reminds us that the Renaissance is certainly a cultural Renaissance, but not necessarily a positive moment for economy, for instance, or for political stability. Moreover, in more recent times, scholarship is challenging the traditional view of Counter-Reformation Italy as a dark moment for women's agency. So the situation is very complex, very rich in nuances, and I am particularly honored to have been able to attract here Paola Ugolini, because she has been studying the Renaissance, women's writing, and gender for a very long time, and we could have no better guide to navigate these complex matters. Paola is in fact associate professor of Italian at the Department of Roman Languages and Literature, and also affiliate faculty in the Department of Global Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University at Buffalo. Quite long, okay? She is the co-editor of the companion to Pietro Aretino with Marco Faini, and has published extensively on Ludovico Ariosto, Gaspara Stampa, Pietro Aretino, and early modern satire. Most importantly, she is the author of The Court and Its Critics, Anti-Courtly Sentiments in Early Modern Italy, published by the University of Toronto Press 2 years ago, in 2020, where she devotes wonderful paragraphs to the question of gender, intended as both femininity and masculinity. Then, after Paola, with Marco Faini, we will consider the context of relationships that are both romantic and intellectual, such as the one between Bembo and Savorgnan. History, art, music, literature offer plenty of examples of great intellectual collaborations within couples, where usually the female contribution hasn't been fully recognized. Let's put it like this. I can recall Robert and Clara Schumann, or Marie and Pierre Curie, for example, and Voltaire and Émilie du Châtelet. And I'm sure any of you can add dozens of names. And in all these stories, the pattern is pretty much the same. The female contribution has been rediscovered only in recent times. Well, when we speak of Pietro Bembo, we are speaking of one of the most influential intellectuals of Italian language, literature, culture in general. And as you know, language and literature in Italy have been crucial in history too, because Italy existed as a cultural, linguistic, literary identity well before becoming a nation. Bembo's book collection, says Dionisotti, is the most important of the early 16th century Italian culture, in the sense that Bembo's readings shaped his intellectual profile, and through him, they influenced Italian culture in general. And for instance, while Italian early modern intellectuals were generally not so interested in Spanish culture, as Massimo Danzi says in a beautiful recent book, Bembo read Spanish texts and also tried to write something in Spanish, and he owed this to a woman, to Lucrezia Borgia, the woman who he fell in love with after Maria Savorgnan, as Marco will explain to us. Lucrezia Borgia, Duchess of Ferrara, was the one who brought Spanish language and culture, books and manuscripts to Ferrara, and, as says Pioraina, personally gave Bembo Spanish manuscripts and books to read. Perhaps also because, as we saw last time with Bolzoni and Tylus, shared reading is a fundamental part of the love relationship as it was conceived in the emotional community we are dealing with. So I am delighted to have here Marco Faini, who has an incredibly international profile and has just moved to the US, to the University at Buffalo, after working at Cambridge, UK and Harvard, among other institutions. He co-edited with Paola the companion to Pietro Aretino. He has recently published a lot about the topic of doubt in modern Europe, and most importantly for us, he is the author of Bembo's biography, you say here, which has been published in Italian, English and French, and is indeed a very pleasant reading, not only for academics. It's perfect, for instance, for these cooler days. I can see all of you in your homes by the window catching the autumn sun with a cup of tea and L'Alloro e la Porpora, or A Life in Laurel and Scarlet in your hands. So, well, I will now leave the floor to our guest speakers. We'll start with court ladies and courtesans, lovers and beloveds, women in early modern Italy. Please join me in welcoming Paola Ugolini.
Hi. First of all, I would like to thank Ida for this wonderful presentation, and also Eugenio and Stefano Albertini and the entire Department of Italian Studies for having me here, but also for all they gave me when I was a graduate student. Thank you. So, as Ida was saying, I'm going to give a general introduction on the topic of women, courts, women writing, what happens when women become the writer, etc. But let's start from this man, Pietro Bembo. To his contemporaries, Pietro Bembo was known both as a celebrated author and as a character in Baldassar Castiglione's Libro del Cortegiano, a dialogue divided into 4 days in which Bembo himself, at the end of the 4th day and final day, takes the center stage and launches into a passionate speech on the nature of love. The Libro del Cortegiano was a very influential text in Renaissance society, as it was the first codification of rules of conduct for both the male courtier and its female counterpart, the court lady. In the book, the importance of the figure of the court lady is signaled by the long section dedicated to the querelle des femmes that Ida has just mentioned, which means the debate over the nature and the possible roles in society for women that was a preoccupation and a common topic of discussion for the educated elites of Renaissance Europe. And a discussion which in the Cortegiano takes place in the 3rd day of the dialogue. In addition, although women say very little in the Cortegiano, their very presence as interlocutors in the dialogue, as Virginia Cox has noted, is indeed remarkable. I'm sorry, I forgot to open my PowerPoint. I'm going to do it now before it is too late. Oh, okay, sorry. There, here I am. Oops. There you go. Okay. Sorry. As I was saying, something that Ida also recently mentioned, for a very long time, the prevailing interpretations of women's status in the Renaissance was the one set by Joan Kelly Gadol in her seminal essay, Did Women Have a Renaissance? According to Joan Kelly, women endured subjection to a patriarchal male order, even during the cultural renewal of an otherwise progressive Renaissance. However, recent scholarship has been moving away from John Kelly's pessimistic perspective, and over the past few years, scholars have focused on the spaces reserved for women to exercise power or cultural influence. Although it is unquestionable that women had fewer opportunities for political and cultural influence, studies have underscored how over the course of the 16th century, elite women became prominent advisors to their spouses and children and acted as regents of states, patrons of the arts, consumers of cultural artifacts, and as writers and artists. Many scholars also stress how the court, as the site of political power and as a locus for cultural production, played an important role in the emergence of women as protagonists. Renaissance Italian courts also allowed close interaction between their male and female members that might be considered unprecedented in its extent and features. Scholarship has offered different interpretations of the activities and functions of women at court, either as the male courtiers' audience for their performance of courtliness, of the courtly art, and therefore as judges of men's behavior, or as an effeminizing presence that contributed to a lack of manliness in court men. Court women have additionally been seen as the enforcers of a civilizing process that eventually led to the domestication of a class of former warriors, transforming them into refined courtiers. Theories based on Norbert Elias's work have explained the courtiers' discontent as the malaise of warriors who witnessed themselves being tamed by a female-dominated and emasculating court. The new relevance for women that was allowed and supported by the rise of court culture did not mark, however, the end of the secular tradition of Aristotelian theories that defined women as nothing more than an imperfect version of men, as testified by the anti-women outbursts by some characters in the Libro del Cortegiano. Outbursts that are, however, juxtaposed with the praise of female virtues. The presence of discussions on the nature and role of women, such as the one featured on the Cortegiano, provide evidence that it was no longer possible to deny women a place in the sophisticated society of 16th century Italian courts. Renaissance court society was also, as I briefly mentioned earlier, unprecedentedly mixed in terms of interactions between genders. Such interactions provoked anxieties that are revealed by the contrasting attitudes towards women expressed by the literary works of the time. These anxieties concerned, first and foremost, the very presence of women at court, and in particular, the opportunities for exercising certain forms of influence that the courts offer to women, the one I mentioned earlier. The rise of courts as centers of power, culture, and patronage provided many women of the elite classes with the opportunity to act as patrons of artists and writers. When not directly responsible for distributing allowances, women were powerful intermediaries who could recommend aspiring protégés to their spouses. Wives of rulers of early modern Italian courts could also directly experience leadership on numerous occasions, when acting in place of their husbands when the men were away at war, or as regents for their minor children, and as dowagers after the death of a spouse. The influence of such women, as well as the honest admiration that many of them could inspire for their culture and for their administrative abilities, was counterbalanced by the persistence of misogynist notions grounded in Aristotelian biology that saw women as unfit for leadership because of a childlike, underdeveloped nature and a psychological instability that made them easy prey to passions and whims. Moreover, scholars have highlighted a persistent concern in Castiglione's Cortegiano about the threats that court life poses to the courtier masculinity. Courtly arts were perceived as potentially effeminizing, and court life became the target of satirical attacks that focused on such a potentially emasculating effect. The notion of the possible emasculation of the courtier has been linked to the female presence at court, related to the courtier's abandonment of military pursuits, and the all-male environment in favor of their refined ways of courtliness, and to their need to integrate in the mixed court society, wherein women were often depicted as invested with the role of evaluators of men's behavior. In Renaissance Italy, this uneasiness about female influence at court intersected with a general sense of malaise related to court life in general, a feeling which is described with the terms anti-courtliness or anti-court sentiments, which is the topic that I explored in depth in my book, The Court and Its Critics, that Ida quoted earlier. In an influential article, David Quint has shed new light on the anti-women sentiments uttered in the Cortegiano by arguing that the expressions of resentment against the ladies can be read as actually directed against the prince. According to Quint, women, already the object of a century-long misogynistic tradition that described them as fickle and vain, and depicted by patriarchal conventions as the cruel, unrequiting beloved who keep their faithful suitors in a state of perennial dissatisfaction, became an easy target for the courtiers' anger towards princes they perceived as capricious in their favors, often rewarding unworthy courtiers over the loyal and virtuous ones. Quint's innovative reading of the Cortegiano paves the way for a wider exploration of the bond that tied together anti-women and anti-court sentiments in early modern Italian culture. The connection between anti-women and anti-court sentiments result in a complicated picture wherein the anxieties over the affirmation of women in the courtly scene, over the perceived progressive feminization of a subjugated Italy and of powerless courtly elites, and over la corte, the court, personified as a female figure that can simultaneously repulse and attract her subjects, intertwine, with intriguing consequences for the cultural sphere. In the context of this explosive mixture, anti-women and anti-court sentiments together become ready-made, easily available, and easily understandable languages to explore and express discontent in early modern Italian society. The reason why misogynistic language could be employed in the apparently unrelated field of anti-court complaints becomes clear when one considers that, as Cesare Caporali, a 16th century satirist, points out in the capitolo titled La Corte, the court itself is a woman. And this is my first slide. I'm going to read this very briefly in Italian, but you can find the English translation on my left. La corte si dipinge una matrona, con viso asciutto e chioma profumata, dura di schiena e molle di persona, la qual sen va d'un drappo verde ornata, benché attraverso a guisa di ercol tiene una gran pelle di asino ammantata. Le pendon poi dal collo aspre catene, per propria d'apocagine o per male che sciorse le potrebbe, e uscir di pene. A di specchi e scopette una reale corona e tien sedendo sulla paglia un piede in bordello e l'altro all'ospedale. It's kind of funny, no? Cesare Ripa, in his Iconologia, a book of images derived from ancient and contemporary sources, quotes Caporali's personification of the court as a woman and adds an additional portrait of the court in female attire that you can find here. Donna giovine con bella acconciatura di testa, vestita di verde e di cangiante, con ambe le mani s'alzi il lembo della veste dinanzi, in modo che scuopra le ginocchia, portando nella veste alzata molte ghirlande di varie sorti di fiori, e con una di dette mani terrà anco degli ami legati in filo di seta verde, e avrà ai piedi una statuetta di Mercurio, la quale s'appoggerà alquanto, e dall'altra banda un paio di ceppi d'oro, ovvero i ferri che si sogliono mettere ad ambo i piedi, e che vi siano con essi le catene d'oro. Le catene parimente d'oro. Sarà la terra ove si posa sassosa, ma sparsa di molti fiori che dalla veste decadano, e nei piedi avrà le scarpe di piombo. Ripa's description makes explicit the sexual allure of the young woman representing the court, expressed by her lascivious gesture of lifting her skirt to reveal her knees. The identification of the court with a lady, and most importantly, a lady which can be the object of one's love, was further fostered by the commutability of the language of courtly love and the language of patronage that has been pointed out by David Quint and by Lauro Martinez. In their studies, both Quint and Martinez have underlined how the language of love poetry, with its offers of service and praise in exchange for requests for favor, matches the language and the structure of patronage. Such a similarity is also strengthened by the fact that, as Quint puts it, and I quote, "Not only does the lover serve the lady he loves, but the courtier is to love the prince he serves." End of quote. In writing on courts, the analogies between the language of love and the language of patronage result in complex patterns that become a precious tool for exploring the dynamics of enchantment with the court, of bitter disappointment with it, and of residual attraction to it in spite of all the disillusion which can be found in anti-court documents. In analyzing the connections between love and courtliness, it is important to stress that the role of the lover and the role of the courtier are alike in their both being based on a disparity between the one who can grant favor, the beloved or the prince, and the one who assumes a posture of self-abasement in order to request such favor, the lover or the courtier. Furthermore, one must underscore how the disquieting female figures that one can find in Renaissance texts recall a recurring feature of misogynistic discourse, the fear of women holding a position of power. Seen, as I said, as weak bodies hosting whimsical minds, women were considered naturally unfit for legal and political authority or responsibility. Such representations were rooted in a tradition that, as stated by Virginia Cox, saw, and I quote, female rule in itself and as a perversion of natural order. End of quote. The court, already the object of satirical representations that depicted it as a world turned upside down, un mondo alla rovescia, could also appear a suspicious reversal of the natural order for the significant role that its environment could grant to women, and hence become the epitome of the disastrous consequences of subverting such order as well. In discussing women in Renaissance Italy, there is one more figure that needs to be taken into account. The Renaissance was also the time of the courtigiane, or courtesans, women of mostly humble origins who were in some cases able to attain literary fame and considerable wealth, while at the same time embodying a total rejection of the dogma of female chastity. The use of periphrases such as donna di corte, court lady, or donna di palazzo, lady of the palace, in court manuals to refer to the female counterpart of the cortigiano instead of the feminine cortigiana was a prudent way to avoid the ambiguities implied in a term that had come to designate high-class prostitutes. If the courtesan could represent a disturbing figure for the court lady, she was an even more disquieting mirror for the male courtier. Courtiers and courtesans alike, in fact, relied on the ability to ingratiate potential patrons by making a show of themselves and their qualities. Both shared anxieties about upward social mobility. dreams of being rewarded by their patrons, and nightmares of falling from grace. The rapid rise and, at times, dramatic fall of these women has prompted scholars to draw a parallel between the fate of the courtesan and that of the courtier. These studies read misogynist anti-courtesan satires as the reaction of the disabused courtiers against the subjection and the loss of dignity that the courtier and the courtesan have in common. The parallel between courtiers and courtesans also shed light on the reasons behind a growing uneasiness with the figure of the courtier. One of the most common accusations against the courtesan is that she has no high purpose in mind. All she wants is money, favors, and commodities. According to anti-court satires, so does the courtier. All the statements concerning his role as an advisor to his prince or his dedication to art and culture are lies used to hide his greed. Equally false are the courtesan's declarations of love for her paramours and the courtier's affection for his prince. With the sole aim of satisfying their greed, the courtier and the courtesan renounce what everyone should hold most dear, independence and control over one's own persona. Both are constantly performing, and both are ready to become whatever their patron wants them to be. Both, furthermore, seems to have put aside any shame to achieve their interest. The reason behind courtiers' analogy to courtesans is to be found in a court society that has degenerated from its role as the haven of courtesy to become instead the cradle of whoredom. In sum, the court is not simply a woman, the court is a courtesan. And the satire Della Corte, written by Gabriello Simeoni, that I'm gonna read. Chi vuol saper che cos'è stento e morte, legga me ora, intanto che io descrivo la miseria e pericolo della corte. Sepoltura e prigione dell'uomo vivo è questa Circe, anzi trasforma l'uomo dall'essere proprio nel suo primo arrivo. Proprio è la corte come una puttana, che par bella di fuori e poscia dentro, parte non ha che si ritrovi sana. So, as you can see, this satire sums up the allusions to the court's bewitching charms and the innuendos to the meretricious strategies of courtly life by straightforwardly defining the court as Circe, a Circe, and a whore. Here, the personification of the court into a female figure is taken much further than the figure of the matron offered by Cesare Caporali's Capitolo or by the charming lady in Cesare Ripa's Iconologia. Just like a courtesan, the court devises clever strategies to entice desire, takes as much as she can from those who are naive enough to think they can conquer her, and then discards them when they are no longer of use. In the case of writing on courts, as I hope to have shown, the writer-lover can bend the language of love lyrics, the language of love lyrics, to a particular use that allows him to express the discontent of the court literati towards the court. Petrarchist love lyrics, heavily codified in terms of gender roles, the woman is cruel and distant, unrewarding to her faithful male suitor, provided the basis for this use of the language of love to lament about a court personified as a fascinating but distant and cruel beloved, as I have explained. So what I haven't been exploring so far could also be styled as uses and misuses of the language of love by male writers in their intertwining of discourses against the court and discourses on love, and of anti-court and anti-courtesan sentiments. In the conclusive part of my talk, I would like to explore a case of appropriation of the patriarchal model of love lyrics by a woman, and I will focus on a figure who has been praised by scholarship for the originality of her love lyrics, and also a woman who spent her adult life in Bembo's native Venice, and whose social status located her outside of the standards of decorum for a woman of her time, making her instead closer to the figure of the notorious courtesan. I'm talking about poet, singer, and lute player Gaspara Stampa. And this is a possible, presumed portrait of Stampa. The daughter of a jeweler, Gaspara Stampa was born in Padua in 1523. Shortly after her father's death, she moved with her mother and siblings to Venice, the city where she would later gain fame as a virtuosa. praised for her poetry, her skills as a lutenist, and her singing voice, Gaspara, together with her sister Cassandra, would soon become a fixture of the Venetian salon scene. Her success, however, did not spare her from criticism. As a female performer, and more egregiously, as a woman who was sexually active outside of wedlock, she had 2 daughters with Andrea Gritti, a member of the influential Venetian family, she became the target of satirical sonnets that downgraded her professional status to one of a simple prostitute. On or around Christmas Day, presumably in 1548, Stampa met Count Collaltino of Collalto. This is a possible armor for Collaltino of Collalto at the Met. Stampa met Count Collaltino of Collalto, to whom the majority of her rime is dedicated. Her poems depict her unhappy love for the handsome and valiant but indifferent Count Collaltino. When Stampa died in 1554, most of her poems were left unpublished, and a few months later, the rime were published under the supervision of her sister Cassandra. An important point that is always raised in conversations about Stampa is the social distance separating her, the jeweller's daughter, from her beloved, the noble-born Count Collaltino. Also noteworthy is the fact that in her lyrics, Stampa constructed her poetic persona as a model of constancy in love, fashioning herself as La Fidelissima Anassilla, the most faithful Anassilla, a pseudonym that Stampa chose for herself based on the word Anaxus, the Latin name of the river Piave that ran through Collaltino's estate, and juxtaposing her unwavering constancy to the unfaithfulness of her beloved Count. As noted by Janet Levaris-Marr, Stampa's insistence on her own fidelity gives her the moral upper hand and recalibrates the distance that separates her social standing from Collaltino. Ultimately, Stampa intends to affirm to her readership the superior quality of her love in comparison to the fickle feelings of her socially superior beloved, and thus her higher moral status. In this way, she also reverses the traditional gender roles that saw women as inconstant and unrewarding, the same stereotypes that form the basis for her personification, for the personification of the court as a woman. One more important feature of Stampa's writing is the explicit, almost unashamed aspirations to fame voiced in her poems. A relevant example of this attitude is offered by the contrast between Francesco Petrarca's proemial sonnet, Voi che ascoltate in rime sparse il suono, and Stampa's proemial sonnet, Voi che ascoltate in queste meste rime, which is modeled on Petrarca but with significant departures from the original. I'm not going to read these two, I'm just going to show them in the original Italian and then in English translation. And I will limit myself to pointing out how Stampa transforms Petrarca's request for pity and forgiveness into her own aspiration to glory and pardon. And her conclusion, which moves away from Petrarca's condemnation of all earthly things and focuses instead on an imagined audience of women who admire the intensity of her feelings to the point of wishing to be her peers. And I'm sorry, I'm not quoting the translation, but this is the translation by Jane Tylus of Stampa's Ring. In expressing her ambition, Stampa is following the example of Pietro Bembo, who, as Marco will show in his talk, often stated his aspirations to being recognized for his work. However, even when confronted with Bembo's model, Stampa's focus on obtaining glory seemed particularly intense. Interestingly enough, Stampa's pursuit of poetic glory also resonates with other women writers of her time. Renaissance Italian courts in particular prided themselves over the presence of learned women among their ranks. Again, Bembo himself had a relevant role in the new recognition given to women by addressing them as his cultural interlocutors and intellectual peers. And finally, as pointed out by Cox, Renaissance Italy popularized the idea that, and I quote, feminine respectability was not incompatible with a quest for fame, end of quote. In the case of Stampa, I maintain, the quest for fame intertwines with a very original posture in her relationship with her male beloved that illustrates a possible outcome, and a very innovative one, of having the woman traditionally cast in the role of the passive beloved, assuming the active role of writer and lover. And I would like to conclude my talk by presenting Stampa's Sonnet 94 the one in which I believe her relationship with her beloved reaches the most interesting point. I'm going to read Sonnet 94 very quickly. A che conte assalir chi non repugna? A che gittar per terra chi si rende? A che contender con chi non contende? Con chi avete mai sempre fa l'ugna? Sapete che coi morti non si pugna, che lo splendor d'un cavaliere offende, e il vostro più che l'ali oggi mai stende, ove non so s'altrui chiarezza giugna. Guardate che la fama delle tante vostre vittorie poi non renda oscura, signor, quest'una sola e non l'amante. Io per me stimerei mia gran ventura l'esser veduta al vostro carro innante, ma voi del vostro onor abbiate cura. What I find particularly intriguing in this poem is how the poet's initial posture of humbleness and subjection to her beloved is reversed into a posture of power through a dynamics that is very typical of Stampa's rime and that has been labeled by critics as passive-aggressive, and I believe it is indeed passive-aggressive. In the quatrains, as you can see, the poet represents herself as being completely in her beloved's power. She states that she does not fight back, she has yielded, she won't resist, and he always had her between his claws. Count Colaltino is praised for his splendor, a reference to his deeds on the battlefield. He was in fact a celebrated condottiero. But in the tercets, we have a significant change in tone. Stampa points out that the fame of Colaltino's many triumphs could be darkened by one victory, the one that he has gained against his defenseless lover. By taking pride in having defeated the one who loves him, Colaltino may, in fact, lose his honor. What strikes me is how Colaltino's potential loss of honor could come to be. How would Colaltino's peers and admirers know of his cruelty towards his lover, if not through her very own fame as a poet? It is, let's remember, Stampa's exceptional suffering for love, as pointed out in her first sonnet, le pene mie tra l'altre prime, the suffering that vanquish all others, that will grant her glory among le bennate genti, the well-born, and make her the object of other women's envy. According to the reading that I am proposing, the danger to Colaltino's honor would come precisely from Stampa's writing about their love. His unworthy victory, his cruelty towards the faithful lover whom has always had between his claws, sempre avuto tra l'ugna, would become known thanks to the composition and dissemination, also through public performance. Let's remember that Stampa was a fixture of Venetian salons, as I said, of those very rhymes that describe the woman poet's love for her unrewarding condottiero. According to this reading, Stampa's final verse, in which she addresses her beloved directly, voi del vostro onore abbiate cura, you should be mindful of your honor, could sound like a threat. And yet, the notion of Stampa threatening Colaltino's reputation needs to be taken with a caveat. As pointed out by Smar, Stampa's accusations of inconstancy and lightness to her male beloved offer no real menace to his reputation, especially given her inferior social status. Very differently from what would have happened if a male writer had accused a female beloved of the same flaws. Still, the boldness of Stampa's claim, the be mindful of your honor statement, is worth pointing out. It could also be worth noticing that Colaltino himself was a poet, which could lead one to wonder whether Stampa could have been asking to be recognized by her beloved as an intellectual peer, or even, in virtue of the fame and glory that she was so blatantly pursuing, as the one whose writings would have gone down in history. In conclusion, what I would like to highlight is that while male writers could refer to the language of love to vent their discontent about their position at court by casting themselves in the role of the unfairly neglected lover, and by personifying the court as the figure of the stereotypical unrewarding beloved, women, by assuming the roles of writers and lovers, could appropriate the same discourse and make very different uses of it, and in some cases, like Stampa, maybe surpass the traditional boundaries of the discourse on love. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paola, for this really interesting and fascinating talk. I have plenty of questions, but I will wait for the Q&A session, and I will now ask Marco to come here. We'll have Il comun, padre delle Muse, Life, Works and Passions of Pietro Bembo. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you, Ida, for having us today. Thank you to Casa Italiana as well, and thank you all for coming. While I open my PowerPoint, thank you for advertising my book. I don't know if it's a great read, actually. While you were speaking, I was reminded that actually the first review that came out of my book was on a Swiss newspaper, and the journalist who wrote the review said that, yeah, the book was quite interesting, but he said something like Marco Faini n'est pas Alexandre Dumas, and said that the book was actually, I was trying to be entertaining, but I failed, so I don't know, give it a try. Let me start from here. Okay, let me start by reading this passage from Giacomo Leopardi's, the great Italian poet, Zibaldone. So on February 27, 1827, Giacomo Leopardi drafted in his Zibaldone a bitter assessment of the classicist Antonio Cesari and his ideas on literary imitation. I'll read it in Italian, but you have the English translation. Il Bembo fu un Cesari del Cinquecento, il Cesari è un Bembo dell'Ottocento. Simili negli effetti che hanno operati e nelle circostanze dei tempi quanto alla lingua e nei mezzi usati e nelle opinioni, cioè nella devozione al Trecento, eccetera. Ma similissimo anche nell'essere loro naturale, lasciando l'essere vicini di patria ed una provincia stessa. Molta lettura e studio, nessuno ingegno da natura, nessuna sembianza di esso acquistata per l'arte, mai ni un barlume, ni una scintilla di genio, di felice vena nei loro scritti. Aridità, sterilità, nudità e deserto universalmente. Pochi ognuno dei nostri autori e libri che hanno avuto fame e che si stampano ancora furono mai così poveri per questa parte come il Bembo e gli scritti suoi. Leopardi's judgment concerns primarily Bembo's works, and yet, what kind of soul could give birth to a universal desert? Leopardi's attack on Bembo is probably unique, although already from the 16th century it is not uncommon to find a sense of discomfort toward his works, exceedingly polished but lacking genius and, one might say, soul. 15 years before Leopardi, the now forgotten Francesco Angiolini, and rightly so, wrote a short biography of Bembo, which appeared in a collection of lives and portraits of illustrious Italians. Bembo's works stood out for a certain refined elegance, a gentilezza di tratto e di maniere that was typical of Renaissance Italians, and that at the time Angiolini was writing was known as bon ton, after the French appropriated it. You see Napoleon. Unfortunately, Bembo's works, and I quote, hold now an honorable and distinguished place in libraries, but are not read apart by those who busy themselves in the study of our language. Bembo's works never sparked the same interest and fascination that, Leopardi aside, his personality did. If his works lay almost forgotten on dusty bookshelves, his life continued to inspire awe and serve as an example. On the occasion of the opening of the academic year 1822 of the Imperial Royal Imperial Regio Liceo of Venice, Andrea Zambelli, who was a professor of universal history, but especially Austrian, that was the title of his chair, addressed the students and professors, as well as the intervening dignitaries, with a praise of Pietro Bembo, un elogio di Pietro Bembo cardinale. Turning to authorities and fellow professors, Zambelli said, You most wise interpreters of the royal will, behold in Cardinal Bembo, friend and counselor of two popes, those very virtues that make you close to the throne. You, my distinguished colleagues, recognize in him the example of all great preceptors. Students, in turn, will find in Bembo a guide to both well-writing and good behavior, necessary skills to become accomplished civil servants of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it's certainly ironic that at the dawn of, in 1822, at the dawn of the Italian Risorgimento, the Italian and Venetian Pietro Bembo could become the role model for the imperial royal youth. And I apologize for these funny anecdotes, which I chose quite randomly among many others. However, they show how Bembo's personality and his unique biography exerting a long-lasting fascination. His charisma was recognized by his early biographers, such as Giovanni della Casa and Lodovico Beccadelli, as well as by the author of an anonymous 1552 biography, according to whom Bembo's life, and I quote, exceeds the common life of many other illustrious persons, and therefore could appear to the reader suspicious and incredible. This amazing life. It was probably bigger than an amazing character. It is this charming man who exchanged letters with Maria Savorgnan between June 1500 and September 1501, and it is the same, and I quote, Messer Pietro Cordialissimo, who corresponds between June 1503 and the fall of 1505 with the Duchess of Ferrara, Lucrezia Borgia. And yet, however charming the man, however polished his works, one detects in them a sense of anxiety, a dissatisfaction, a sharp perception of the contradictions of his time. In this talk, I will try to expose some of the secret cracks disguised under the shiny surface of Bembo's impeccable style. In doing so, I will often refer to women, for it is women that often make these cracks visible. Before turning to Bembo's works, let me remind that it would be hard to understand his literary trajectory without women. Maria Savorgnan, Lucrezia Borgia, Caterina Cornaro, Emilia Pio, Elisabetta Gonzaga, Elisabetta Querini are in turn lovers, correspondents, dedicatees, interlocutors, sometimes masters. With all of them, Bembo entertains meaningful relations that reverberate on his work. The common father of the Muses, as he was defined at some point, saw the women with whom he corresponded as intellectual peers, asking for their suggestions and often gladly accepting them. Bembo's letters bear witness to his productive relationships with women. It is, to my knowledge, a unique case, whose distinctiveness we can assess by comparing it to a contemporary collection of letters. Let us take, for example, the case of Pietro Aretino's 6 volumes of letters, in which women abound but are hardly intellectual interlocutors. Or again, let us take the case of the Lettere di molte valorose donne, the first collection of letters entirely by women, edited by Ortensio Lando. In this collection, many of the letters are actually either ventriloquized or written by Lando himself. So it's not surprising that the 4th volume of Bembo's letters, published posthumously in 1552, contains exclusively letters addressed to women, 17 ladies of, okay, should be this one. Yeah. 17 ladies of high social standing, including 2 of the most renowned women poets of the time, Vittoria Colonna and Veronica Gambara. The collection contains also the letters to Maria Savorgnan and Lucrezia Borgia, included in the 2nd section of the volume, although with some hesitation on the part of the printer, since their, and I quote, tender and affected style did not befit the white-haired, that's the definition, man that most readers had come to know. And that is Bembo, the Cardinal Bembo, as it appears on the beautiful portrait on the cover of my book. In his dedication letter to Elisabetta Querini, the editor downplayed the content of those, and I quote, poor and naked letters, since their topics were humble, everyday matters, only made precious by the richness of Bembo's style, on the assumption that women can only talk about everyday matters. And this is Clearly, a misogynistic attitude, one with which Bembo himself would have disagreed. And it is in fact enough to peruse the letters sent by Bembo to the dedicatee of the work, Elisabetta Querini, to dismiss the publisher's words. Written during Bembo's old age from 1537 to 1544, so when Bembo was 67, he was born in 1470. These letters bear witness not only to their affectionate friendship, sealed by a portrait of hers that Bembo commissioned to Titian and is now lost, but also to Elisabetta's intellectual profile. And I have here this is a medal of Elisabetta, and that's a copy of the last portrait. Not only Elisabetta presents Bembo with refined gifts, a medal, an ancient marble bust, but like Maria Savorgnan so many years before, she provides suggestions on the poems that Bembo, soon to be cardinal, still composed. For example, she was concerned that in a canzone in memory of his late Morosina, the mother of Bembo's children, Bembo had called her Saint, Santa, an objection that Bembo took seriously, providing an articulate theological explanation. As he repeatedly states, the canzone belonged to Elisabetta as much as to himself, as she had provided constant feedback, and this is typical of Bembo, this continuous asking for feedback to the women he was writing to. Although the volume does not include Elisabetta's letters, we know that Bembo praised her, and I quote, pure and beautiful and gentle manner in writing. And it was again Elisabetta who persuaded Bembo to translate in the vernacular his Venetian history, which he had originally written in Latin. In a letter from February 1544, Bembo acknowledged Elisabetta's advice to translate the work in the vernacular, since the Italian language was, according to Elisabetta, and I quote, used and desired by people more than Latin, end of quote. Elisabetta had even made the point that certainly printers, eager to profit from such an outstanding work, would have it translated. However, knowing how incorrect such translations were, made as they were hastily to please the public's requests, it would have been advisable for Bembo to submit his own translation. It was finally Elisabetta who managed, after Bembo's death, to have the work published. And I find this letter very interesting and in some ways exemplary, for it shows that Elisabetta was not only a refined writer of prose and reader of poetry, she also had a surprisingly acute sense of the print market and of the business, and a remarkable awareness and understanding of the role of the vernacular. It is not surprising that in a sonnet dedicated to her, Bembo commended her for being the one who, and I quote, la via di gira al ciel con fermo passo mi insegna, in tutto al vulgo mi ritoglie. She removes him from common people. In his late 60s, Bembo was coming full circle, voicing a long-lasting concern of his, the anxiety over being unable to fulfill his desires to rise above the vulgo. So let us travel back in time to the early 1490s, probably around 1492, when Bembo was in his early 20s. Before Maria, another woman played a central role in young Bembo's literary apprenticeship. She was a fictional woman this time, the main character of a short allegorical work known as Sogno. Where's the slide? Should be. Sorry, I'm just getting lost. This one. This is a work that Bembo composed probably before going to Messina, where he studied Greek, but anyway, around the early 1490s. A child prodigy, Bembo had been composing poetry since he was 8 or 9. In the 1490s, he was not the prominent intellectual that he was soon to become. When he composed the Sogno, as well as he printed this work, probably in 1498, Bembo was still grappling with his literary vocation. He wanted desperately to pursue a career as a scholar, while his father, Bernardo, wanted it to become a civil servant like himself. Bembo probably felt he wasn't strong enough to oppose his father's wishes, and probably, he was also tempted by the all possibilities that opened to a rich and brilliant young Venetian. So it happened that one night, Pietro dreamed of himself, at least this is what he says, he dreamed of himself and of his friend Girolamo Savorgnan, probably a member of the same Savorgnan family to which Maria belonged. They were in their room, and this room had turned into a cold cave full of flowers. Inside, both naked, Pietro was leaning on a rock while Girolamo was sitting on the grass. Pietro all melancholic, as he describes himself, and Girolamo pensive and sad. Suddenly, a woman appears dressed in humble clothing like a beggar, and she delivers a long speech extolling human beings among all creatures. Yet, many of them, like Pietro and Girolamo, squandered their time and their gifts in vain occupations. Pietro and Girolamo should come out of the common people, smart again, the common people, uscite fuori dal fango dei volgari. Who was this woman? According to some, she was an allegory of philology. According to others, an allegory of philosophy. Probably doesn't matter to establish it now. But whatever she was, her powerful speech makes Bembo tremble in fear and shame, like a pilot who finds himself at sea in a storm. This is what Bembo writes. And this is also, by the way, a much-loved metaphor that recurs obsessively in Bembo's works. It is women, either allegorical or real, who, in times of crisis, intervene to help Bembo and put him back on the right track. Young Bembo certainly wanted to heed the mysterious woman's advice, yet his first published work was most likely the Latin dialogue on his ascent to Mount Etna, which came out in 1496. Although this work is interesting in many respects, including its font, specifically designed and still in use, it's the Bembo type, and the innovative use of commas, colons, and semicolons, it hardly caused a stir on the Venetian print market. His first major work, the Asolani, was underway since around 1496 and 1497, but he was unsatisfied with himself and with the worldly affairs that prevented him from devoting himself to literary otium. In a letter to his friend Trifone Gabriele, he complained that his studies proceeded poorly and his Asolani were fast asleep, as he put it. At the turn of the 15th century, Bembo was feeling stuck and probably lost. The 1500s, however, opened with two major and finally successful undertakings, the edition of Petrarca's Rime in 1501 and of Dante's Divine Comedy in 1502. Still, I dare say, some of the sense of uneasiness voiced by Bembo in his letters was still lingering on. Still, in May 1506, in a beautiful and long letter to the Duchess of Urbino, Elisabetta Gonzaga, and to Emilia Pio, Bembo complained that his father was preventing him from going to Rome and pursue his studies, while pushing him along the path on a quote of ambition and honors, something that Bembo wasn't interested in. The problem was that at the time Pietro did not have an income of his own, and his father would not give him the money to live, and I quote, according to the level of my condition. So it's not surprising that the first pages of the Asolani, Bembo's first work to enjoy considerable success, are marked by repeated references to sea storms, pilots lost at sea, wanderers losing their way, or being stuck at a crossroads. Sure enough, the introduction to the work is closed by a praise of literature and writing as the means to find order in an otherwise chaotic reality. Yet, under the surface of this work, one detects an anxiety that never really goes away, and in fact, the work closes on a most unhappy note with a reference to rivers of blood and the world turned upside down by the wars that were ravaging Italy. Set in the court of Asolo, ruled by Caterina Cornaro, former Queen of Cyprus, this is a portrait of Caterina. who was dispossessed of her kingdom after the passing of her husband, the Asolani are a love dialogue between 3 young men and 3 young women that takes place on the occasion of one of Caterina's ladies-in-waiting's wedding. Like his friend Baldassare Castiglione would do later in his book of the courtier, the first version of the Asolani opens with the memory of a loss. Castiglione recalled the lost word of the court of Urbino and the Duke Guidobaldo, who had been long dead at the time. Bembo instead opened his dialogue mentioning the widowhood of Caterina and her lost kingdom. Even if Caterina was allowed to call herself queen, hers was more a golden exile than a court. Bembo had begun the work during his relationship with Maria Savorgnan and perfected it during that with Lucrezia Borgia. And in fact, some copies of the 1505 first edition of the Asolani bear a dedication letter to Lucrezia. Yeah, the picture's not great, but you can see the dedication letter to Lucrezia Borgia. In this printed version, however, Bembo removed the disturbing reference to the sad events in Caterina's life. And yet, the opening and closing page of the work testify to Bembo's anxiety toward personal, political, and metaphysical mutability, instability, and unpredictability. Bembo accumulates similes and metaphors related to uncertainty, which, even if may seem traditional when taken separately, nonetheless picture a troubling landscape in their accumulation. Bembo's assumption in the Asolani is that among the reasons that make our life stormy and doubtful, love takes the first place. According to this assumption, he opens the dialogue recalling how sailors lost in the darkness of a stormy sea are eager to find if and from where the wind of Tramontana is blowing, so that they can adjust their route accordingly and reach their destination. Similarly, Bembo claims those who are lost and stand doubtful and uncertain at a crossroads rejoice in finding someone who shows them the right path. Bembo then makes a reference to the pilgrimage of life. We all are pilgrims, but only few of us are not troubled by the fiery winds of passions, and only few of us do not fall prey of, and I quote, the appearance of opinions resembling truth, end of quote. Even if Bembo is apparently speaking only of love and passions, one begins to sense here a deeper, even metaphysical anxiety over identity and permanence. The work, in fact, closes with a speech delivered by a holy hermit who warns Lavinello, one of the characters of the dialogue, to avoid the deceits of the senses, which make the same thing appear, and I quote, sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes beautiful, sometimes ugly, sometimes pleasant, sometimes obnoxious, end of quote. In his speech, the hermit instructs Lavinello to turn to another world in which, and I quote, translation is kind of mine, so it's not great, but just gives you the sense. Grass does not dry up, plants do not get old, animals do not die, the sea does not get rough, the air does not darken, fire does not burn, nor are its stars or skies subjected to continuous movement. That world does not need any change, since it is not bounded by summer or winter, yesterday or tomorrow, proximity or distance, extension or narrowness, and it is perfect in its condition. If in our world, as we have seen, everything contains its contrary or can turn into its contrary, which means that as inside itself the potential of its annihilation, in this other world everything is stable, unchanging, and undeceiving. The Asolani are a love dialogue which in fact revolves around the choice of the right path of life. The final exhortation to an ascetic life, a life of contemplation, confirms that the main problem is that of the choice between pleasure or virtue. Giovanna Rizzarelli has put the work in dialogue with Raphael's almost contemporary Dream of a Night, whose topic appears to be the same. We should keep in mind that when Bembo was drafting his work, so the Asolani, his closest friends were experiencing a process of religious conversion that will lead some of them to abandon their careers as civil servants to embrace life as hermits. Vincenzo Querini and Tommaso, and later Paolo Giustinian, will embrace monastic lives. In the years 1505-1506, they were deepening their knowledge of the scripture and reflecting on their vocation to a cloistered life. Bembo, too, was probably tempted for a short while to join them, as we can gather from some sonnets, such as these two sonnets. I'm not going to read them, but they deal with the idea of leaving the world behind. Just look at the closing lines. The idea is that of forgetting about the world and its temptations. But Bembo never really made up his mind. He never joined his friends on this path of conversion. To his friends, Bembo looked like the Asolani sailors, those mentioned in the introduction to the work, wandering, as he writes, wandering pushed by stormy winds. In fact, in a letter from December 1506 to Vincenzo Querini, Bembo recalls how Querini and his other friends, their common friends, and I quote, say that I am in the midst of the waves at the mercy of fortune, so the same imagery. And in the same letter, Bembo affirms that he is pleased that Querini has turned his mind to that gold, that is, a life of contemplation, that the hermit pointed out to Lavinello. So this letter shows the degree of interaction between Bembo's biographical trajectory and his works. But there is more. In the Asolani, we find a preoccupation with order and stability, or an anxiety toward chaos that seems peculiar to Bembo. Permanence and inalterability were crucial to Bembo. One perceived this preoccupation with stability and order in such different enterprises, such as the Prose della volgar lingua, and I'll come back in a minute to the Prose, where he sets forth the rules of Italian language, as well as in his passion for perfectly tidy and orderly gardens, either fictional, as that of the Asolani, described at the beginning of the work, or real, as the garden of his villa, known as Il Noniano. This is Bembo standing underneath one of the famous poplars of the Noniano villa. The Prose della volgar lingua, probably Bembo's best-known work, along with his poems. Published in 1525, although around 1512 at least two books of the work already existed, they had already been drafted, the Prose aimed to set the standard of Italian written language, overcoming the variety in time and space of the different Italian vernacular languages. Petrarca and Boccaccio provided the models for elegant and lofty poetry and prose, respectively. Many have pointed out that the success of the Prose, while allowing the development of an elegant literary language, contributed to freeze Italian poetry and prose, doomed as they were to an endless repetition of a limited number of topics. And this is probably why, or at least one of the reasons, why Leopardi wrote that bitter judgment on Bembo. Yet the Prose seemed to me a more nuanced work than it may appear, and I'll leave aside the technical content of the work, focusing instead on the more narrative sections that introduce each of the 3 days in which the dialogue is divided. These sections seem to be the trajectory leading from chaos and disharmony to order, and order, for Bembo, is a response to personal and historical wounds. Some of these wounds are displayed in the opening lines of the Prose. In his dedication to Pope Clement VII, Papa Clemente VII, Bembo recalls how the conversations recorded in the work took place at the time, around 1502, when he, the Pope, and his family were exiles. They had been exiled from Florence as a consequence of the French invasion of Italy. He then recalls how the interlocutors of the dialogue met on the day of his brother Carlo's birthday, and how that was going to be his last birthday, for Carlo Bembo died within a year. And immediately after, in a slightly anticlimactic move, Bembo introduces another speaker, his friend Ercole Strozzi, who was at the time, and I quote, crippled and weak. In a sort of concentric, spiraling way, Bembo moves from the misfortunes of Italy to those of the Medici family, to those of his family and friends. This is not the triumphal start that we would expect to a work that aims to set the rules of Italian language. Yet, I argue, it is a necessary step, for grammar rules work toward the restoration of a broader order. They are part of a larger picture and process. Bembo builds, in fact, a scenario of disorder, first recalling the infinite variety of languages spoken in Italy, which, and I quote, transform themselves and change every day. Also, the setting for the dialogue is carefully chosen. It is a cold day when a cold wind blows. The wind, known as rovaio, in fact, has been blowing all morning, and I quote, its breath still roars. The wind has breath, fiato, as Bembo writes. So it is presented, it takes on kind of devilish connotations, much like the devils, sometimes described as winds on the medieval stage. So we have this wind like a devil who is roaring and blowing on the streets of Venice. This devilish wind interferes with the conversation and makes understanding hard, thus redoubling the confusion of languages announced by Bembo at the outset of the dialogue. It is certainly an infernal landscape, and one may recall probably here the diverse lingue orribili favelle of Dante's and similar passages in Dante's Inferno. And this scenery of loss and confusion, and let us remember that in 1502 Bembo had just published Dante's Divine Comedy, is the first step of a sort of anabasis that will eventually lead to harmony. At the end of the dialogue, in fact, the varying and shapeless sounds will turn into a well-ordered language. The Medici family will be restored to its role, with a picture of Pope Clement VII happily reigning on the city of Rome, seen now at the end of the dialogue as the fulcrum of a new civilization, and Carlo Bembo and Ercole Strozzi, no longer suffering in their mortal bodies, will live on in the monument represented by the Prose themselves. The three books of the Prose may be seen as Bembo's own Divine Comedy, a journey from chaos to harmony. In the prologue to the third book, the contemplation of the ruins of Rome, in fact, comes with the praise of the artists, including Leon Battista Alberti, Michelangelo, Raffaello, who study and breathe a new life into the monuments of antiquity. As Lina Bolzoni has beautifully written, and I quote, le rovine di Roma sono reliquie, parti di un tutto che non c'è più, ma anche frammenti da cui possono sprigionarsi di nuovo la forza e la bellezza antica. And again, Professor Bolzoni has traced a hidden reference to Beatrice, Dante's Beatrice in this section, which reinforces, reinforces the idea of the prose as in somehow shaped on the Divine Comedy. Perhaps not by chance, at the beginning of the third book, the wind finally calms down. So when Bembo has finally come to the end of his project, the wind that represented chaos calms down. And Bembo's choice of words is interesting, and he writes, perciò che il vento, che infino stamane così forte ha soffiato, ora si tace. And it's an almost clear quotation from Divine Comedies, Canto 5, the Canto of Paolo e Francesca, when the storm that is carrying Paolo and Francesca stops to allow them to speak with Dante, mentre che il vento come fa si tace. And I suggest that we have reached a point in the dialogue when cosmic and not only linguistic order is re-established. And in fact, Magnifico Giuliano, one of the characters in the dialogue, but also one of Bembo's best friends, affirms, again at the beginning of the last day of the dialogue, that indeed the wind has stopped, and that he was talking precisely of that while sailing, and he writes, in my little boat with Ercole Strozzi. And I see here religious undertones for the connection between the barchetta, that's the word that Bembo uses, and the wind calming down also brings, or may bring with it, the memory of the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus, standing on a boat, on a navicula, again a small boat, tells the winds to calm down. The navicula, as referred to in the Gospel, assailed by evil winds, had become a symbol of the Church, threatened by its persecutors. A most apt reference for a work like the Prose that, although set in the early years of the 16th century, came out 2 years before the sack of Rome. And I come to my conclusion. I hope that these passages will show another side of Pietro Bembo, The 2013 exhibition dedicated to him called him the inventor of the Renaissance. Certainly, he was not the inventor of the Renaissance, yet he epitomized the Renaissance like no other. As a kid, Bembo had the chance to meet Lorenzo il Magnifico in Florence. As a young man, he studied Greek and worked with Aldo Manuzio. He was a philologist, a collector of most exquisite taste, and a poet. He had first-hand experience of the most extraordinary courts of the Renaissance. He was a friend of such artists as Raphael and Titian. He also lived long enough to experience the Italian wars and the decades following the Reformation. At the end of his life, he was appointed cardinal, bishop of Gubbio, and most of all, he probably developed a strong interest in reform ideas. He witnessed the most glorious moments of the Renaissance and its decline. The events that marked Italian history from the end of the 15th century left deep scars on Bembo, and his own complex personality, the acute perception of his contradictions, his ambiguity, never stopped from troubling him. It would be hard today to subscribe to Leopardi's opinion or dismiss his works, as some still do, as pedantic or derivative. If we read them carefully, we'll find in them not only echoes of his extraordinary life, but also a masterful reflection on his time and its wounds. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Now we have the Q&A session, which is open for the in-presence audience, and as I said before, also for the online audience. And Stefano is there. Okay, so he's ready to read the questions. So if you are attending online, please write your questions or comments in the chat, and Stefano will read them loud to us. Thanks. Okay. Are there questions from the audience? Or shall I use the chair's privilege? Okay. Well, I'm really grateful for both your lectures and for, the incredible knowledge that there is behind both of them. And I also seize this opportunity to read again your books, I learned a lot from these readings. A first question that I wanted to ask you, Paola, in your book you talk of feminine enclosed space, right? In reference of referring to the Duchess's private apartments. And Marco, in the first chapter of your biography, you mentioned that Bembo's mother tries to watch young Bembo from her window, and Gabriella Zari, for instance, talks of recinti to describe early modern women's lives. Bembo uses a window to reach Maria's bedchamber, and in theater, in Renaissance theater, for instance, the window is a channel through which women can interact with the other characters. Maria Savorgnan was kind of enclosed in her own house, and Cornaro, as you mentioned, she was a prisoner, a kind of a prisoner in Asolo for political reasons. So if we think of the different states in early modern Italy, they could work differently. For instance, for Jewish women, living in the ghetto of Rome or in the ghetto of Venice could be a very different experience. So geography and space were very important for women's lives. And I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate on this from the different perspective and your different approaches.
Okay, thank you. It's quite a dense question. Well, the notion of the court of Urbino as a, as an enclosed, protective, feminine space. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I was saying that the notion of the court of Urbino as an enclosed maternal space. Well, I quoted it from an essay by Wayne Rebhorn, I hope that my memory serves me well, where he talks about the court of Urbino in the years of Elisabetta Gonzaga as a sort of maternal womb. So you have this figure, of the duchess who did not have children because Guidobaldo could not have children, basically, and who becomes, a sort of maternal figure to the entire court. And you have this notion of this protected space, which is a strongly feminine space because Elisabetta and her lady-in-waiting, Emilia Pio, were actually the authority that allows, the dialogue. That they do not participate that much, as I said. They do not propose the topic, but they are the ones, it's Elisabetta's okay that stops the topic for the conversation at the formare con parole perfetto corteggiano, right? She's the one who says, yeah, we'll discuss the perfect court here. So it's a fascinating notion also because at the end of the second book, you have this sort of invasion from Francesco Maria, the one that they will adopt as the heir because they could not have a child. So, as I said, it's a maternal protective space where women could have some authority, but at the same time, the fact that the space was protected, which this is something I try to do in my book, it also allows speakers to feel free to express some discontent. Because if you read the Libro del Corteggiano thoroughly, I believe, you can actually feel that there are some cracks under the surface and that even in this idyllic space, there is a sort of discontent for court life. However, everything is kind of, I'm almost going to say forgiven, but it's kind of, taken to another side by the fact that in the moment in which this society is described, it is gone forever. So you have this sense of melancholy, right? This past that is remembered, longed for, but at the same time that was not as idyllic as it could seem at the first reading. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay, thank you.
Marco?
I don't know what to say. Paola, I think answered that question, but I think there are different spaces. You remember that beautiful anecdote of Bembo's mother having a dream, and I think the court of Asolo is different, for example, from the court of Urbino. In the court of Asolo, we have a woman who has been dispossessed, and there's that this memory of what happened to Caterina kind of lingers on, and Bembo has to remove it. Sometimes it feels. In Urbino, we have, it's the opposite. In fact, it's the Duke who is sick and he will die soon. So it's actually Elisabetta and Emilia who rule the court. And also, it's very an entertaining court. Bembo writes some very funny and even lascivious works for the carnival, for example. So that's a different story. In some ways, however, it's Bembo himself who feels himself always enclosed somewhere, either in Venice or in his villa. He is never happy. He always tries to move away from something. When he's in Rome, he's dreaming of Padua. Then he goes back and he's dreaming of being again at the center of life, that is Rome. And when, so that's this kind of dynamic. And Bembo has always this dream of, and this sort of ambiguous feeling toward being at the center of things, and then enclosing himself. For example, when he writes to the Duchess of Urbino, give me a room in the monastery of Fontavellana, which is in the Apennine Mountains, and he wants to, close himself in that little room and study, but he is never fully able to commit himself to that. So in some ways, Bembo himself shared this condition with women. He is, this lack of freedom is something, probably that's why I could relate to them, I don't know.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience?
Oh, thank you, Paola. Thank you, Marco, for very exciting, very beautiful discourse. There are many interesting points that I would like to discuss with Marco, but one is, for example, you showed how important is the memory of the Divine Comedy in the prose. This is really a great point. So what do you think? Because you are right that the memory of the Divine Comedy in the passages that you quoted is really important. It's really, I think this is really interesting. In the same time, as you know, in the prose, the model is not Dante, it's Petrarch. So I was wondering, it means that the fascination of Dante for Bembo as a writer was stronger than his position in the general construction of the code of the literary language? There is a kind of contradiction.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you're right. That's exactly the point. It seems that while on the one hand he's praising Petrarch for his beautiful language, he's actually using Dante to build this. It seems that his mind works, I think it's Giovanna Ritrellius writes this beautifully, Bembo's mind works with images, with visions, so it's very visual. He's not a philosopher. He always makes the point of leaving back aside the discussions of philosophers. He needs stories, he needs visions, stories that can be visualized, myths, and probably found that potential more in Dante than in Petrarch. I don't know, it seems to me that he's really using Dante in constructing the structure of the prose. Whatever he writes of Dante as a writer, as a poet in the text, when he has to come up with images, with ideas, with symbols, most of it derives from Dante, and it's right there in the key moments of the prose, of the Tre Giornate. There we have memories of Dante that builds in. So.
Any more questions? Paola, I have a question for you. You talk of appropriation of the Petrarchan code. So not everyone here is familiar with the Petrarchan code and with this specific question in Renaissance study. So my question is, what happens when women poets use the Petrarchan code as a base to build their own lyrical persona?
Yeah. Thank you. This is a point that has been studied extensively by scholarship. So just to give a quick sum up to what is a very, as I said, extensive and fascinating bibliography. For those who are not familiar with the Petrarchan code, the point is, as I briefly summed up in my talk, was that the man was in the position of the lover and the woman was the beloved. So the woman was, distant, cruel, etc. And she had to be, because if she had consented to the relationship, she would have lost her honor and her chastity, etc. So when women start writing poetry in the Renaissance, a challenge that they have to confront is how to use this model and how to cast the man in the position of the cruel and distant beloved, but they cannot use chastity as a reason for their distance, because chastity in a man would have sounded ridiculous, okay? So there are many very different outcomes. I just want to quote Virginia Cox's books on women writers for, the panorama of that. But usually noble-born women, Vittoria Colonna is the most famous case. In her case, the husband was dead. And so, he was distant at war, then was dead, etc. So that was a reason for the poet's longing for a distant beloved. In other cases, in cases of women who did not have to maintain that standard of decorum because they were in a different social position, such as Gaspara Stampa, she can directly accuse Collaltino of cruelty, and she writes what many people consider a sort of morning after sonnet, in where she describes the beauty of the night that they spent together. So, there was a point where actually, he said yes, but then he's always away at battle, just like in the case of noble-born women poets, but at the same time, he can, afford to neglect her. And of course, in her case, a marriage with Collaltino was absolutely out of question. So that was another, possible way in which the woman poet could employ that code of casting the male beloved as distant, unrewarding, cruel, etc.
I saw that someone before was taking notes in the audience. Was it a question? Yeah.
My question is not as profound as everyone else's. When you were talking about the courtesans and two different references, they mentioned that both different women were dressed in green. Was there any significance to green and the dress of courtesans?
That's a good question. I don't know. I know that there were some colors that were allowed for courtesans and some that were not. For example, they were forbidden at some point from wearing, I think it was yellow, or they had to be wearing, oh no, it's the opposite. They had to be wearing yellow. There were some color coding for the dresses of courtesans because they should not be confused with, proper women. But I think in that case, green refers to, what's important in that depiction is more the notion of the cangiante, of the change in color, which I think is related to the allures of this figure, the change, the ups and downs of hope and despair that one goes through, the sort of kind of magical allure that the author wants to convey.
Okay.
If I'm not wrong, maybe green refers to youth, to young age. Could that be? Yeah. But
I think, my personal
yeah.
I think an art historian would be most appropriate to reply to this question. But I think in that case, it's the notion of the shimmering, changing color that is what he wants to convey.
Eugenio, you need the microphone. Yeah.
Thank you both for two great talks. We learned a lot, and it's always a pleasure to hear from you, both actually. So this question, so one little sort of footnote to the point of colors. Since Paola mentioned this, sort of highlighted this idea of the changing colors. Of course, the image of Fortuna from Tasso's Gerusalemme Liberata came to my mind, where there's this changing, ever-changing color palette is part of that notion. And of course, you all know these kind of things much better than I do, but the notion of Fortuna is certainly embedded in all the discourses about life in the Renaissance, but certainly with connections to the discussion of the courtly context. The question which I have is more kind of a comment for you both, but really picking on a point which Marco mentioned at the end of his talk, when you said that maybe it's not totally correct to define Bembo as the inventor of the Renaissance, but certainly he played quite a role in crafting the Renaissance. I was thinking that certainly, while we can't really say that he's the inventor of the Renaissance, he's certainly the kind of person who best embodies, as you were showing, this moment of transition from those, big kind of categories which we tend to take for granted, humanism or early Renaissance, and the sort of peak of the Renaissance, so the 15th century and the 16th century, because it's really a kind of a cerniera, as we say in Italian, right? Sort of combining all this tradition coming from the previous century. And I know that it's wrong to keep thinking about centuries, but still something happens around 1500. Historically, we know that because, of course, we have the Guerra d'Italia looming, on the horizon, and so something is certainly happening there. But I think, as you were showing, he's really the person who witnesses this moment of transition in cultural terms, because he begins in a certain way and he ends up doing things which are fairly different from what he was doing when he was young. And so I'm wondering whether, instead of thinking about him as the inventor of the Renaissance, we might want to think about Bembo as a figure really of a connection between these two different big chunks of the Renaissance, and just, a way to rethink our sort of historiographical categorizations, which are always very problematic, and yet we need them. I mean, I'm thinking also in terms of teaching, right? Because when we teach the Renaissance, we tend to teach something which includes both the Quattrocento and the Cinquecento, and yet these are two very different moments in history. And so he seems to be the ideal figure to move from one to the other.
Yeah, thank you, Zenia. Yeah, that's great. You're right. Bembo was, like I said, he was a prodigy as a kid. His father was a civil servant of the Republic of Venice, and as such he moved around Italy. He went to Florence and he brought young Bembo with himself. He was a kid, so even as a kid he had the chance to meet Lorenzo Magnifico and all the Florentine humanists, and to learn what we call a Neoplatonic philosophy and what we see as quintessentially Renaissance, Florence and the love discourses and that. And then he is able to move away from that. He studies Greek. He goes to Messina and Sicily because he wants to learn Greek. So he becomes an accomplished humanist, and he writes in Greek. He publishes in Latin, and then he understands that at some point has to go. In a way, the times are changing, and exactly around the 1500s. That's when he publishes Petrarca and Dante, of course. But also, it's a time of crisis, probably. It's interesting that it sets the Prose della volgar lingua again in 1502, more or less. And again, he has another work that is quintessentially humanistic. It's a work in Latin about the errors in the tradition of Virgil's works and Terence's works. That's a quintessentially humanistic work. He writes this Latin dialogue in which he tries to correct the errors in the manuscript of Virgil. But then he has an introduction to the work in which he actually, this faith in the continuity between the past and between, and the present is completely gone. He describes the ruins of Rome like dead bodies, and that was partially a topos, but still he has this strong sense of a divide between the past and the present. So he tries to, it's as if he were realizing that really that Renaissance world had come to an end and something new was coming. And in that sense, probably invented something new. That is this new vernacular culture. He was, again, not probably the inventor, but certainly the greatest mind of the Italian vernacular culture of his time. And that was new. And that was the bridge, like you said, toward a new time, the time of the Italian wars, and then from 1517, what we call the Reformation, and that brought the world of humanism to a sudden end. Not that things changed overnight, clearly, but certainly he understood quite quickly that the world he knew when he was a young man had changed. Yeah.
I have one more question for Paola and one more for Marco. So you mentioned that also according to Virginia Cox, a powerful woman was perceived as a natural thing. And I would add that also a learned, an erudite woman would be perceived as an unnatural thing. For instance, when Guarino Veronese was writing to Isotta Nogarola, actually praising her, he tells her that she is so learned and well-read and intelligent that she is not a woman anymore, that she becomes a man. And then afterwards she is accused of sexual perversion, which always happens when a woman tries to pursue her intellectual ambitions. And Bembo, probably for this, he tries to dissuade his daughter Elena from learning music, right? So And also, Professor Bolzoni, I think it's in Una meravigliosa solitudine, you mentioned that law that during the French Revolution, or after the French Revolution, they proposed to forbid education for married women and allow education just for courtesans, right? So what happens when power and the intellectual sphere are connected to women?
Yeah, it's very hard to sum it up in a single question, but again, to refer to Virginia Cox's studies, I mean, she has highlighted in her books how there are different moments in women's education, moments in which, as I briefly quoted in my talk, it was an honor for a court or for a city to have a learned woman among the ranks, and how that ceases to be after a while, right? The reason why this happens is controversial. Traditional scholarship attributes it to the Counter-Reformation, and other scholars, especially in more recent years, started to think that the Counter-Reformation would have actually helped women participate more in the intellectual sphere. But as I said, you know, apart from that very interesting debate, the notion that education for a woman could be controversial was rooted in those Aristotelian biological theories that I mentioned, where women were supposed to have weaker minds and weaker bodies, and therefore they were not suitable for government. They were not suitable for higher education. And what's fascinating is that, as you have mentioned, when a woman was very well educated and accomplished, they would praise her by saying that she had an ingegno quasi virile, you know, she was almost a man. So basically, you know, which it's funny because it can be read as a joke today, right? You know, you're so good that you're almost a man, you deserve to be a man, you're not a woman anymore. But I mean, in terms of gender studies and what it means in terms of, you know, the definition of gender roles, or if you want to quote modern theory of gender as performative, etc., right, Judith Butler, etc., it's kind of fascinating that, you know, man was the standard for education, stability, morality, etc., and that a woman was defined as becoming, you know, almost a man. In some cases, as the one, you know, you were discussing, it becomes threatening, and therefore, you know, a woman almost, it becomes too much, right? And to sum up, you know, it's a very complicated point that had a lot of ups and downs in history, and I think that the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, was noteworthy for allowing, especially in this, you know, in the courtly format, the Serenissima Republic was something else, for allowing women to express, you know, themselves intellectually and culturally. And Pietro Bembo was particularly remarkable for considering women, you know, is basically his peer reviewers, we could say today, right?
Okay, I think we have 5 minutes, so I will go ahead with my question for Marco, that can be also a question for Professor Bolzoni, if you want. Forgive me. So, as you mentioned in your book, friendship is very important too in Bembo's ideas and life. In some occasions, it seems to me that romantic love and love between friends can have the same rules: honesty, sincerity, intense communication, the cuore di cristallo mentioned in both contexts, and in the language of love too. So what are the boundaries between to these emotional realms, and what role does friendship and romantic love play in Bembo's life?
They play a role that's really difficult to overestimate. Yeah, okay, sorry, it's not good. In that Bembo, since his young age, he has this Compagnia degli Amici. That's the name Bembo and his friends give to the gathering that includes actually women and men. So that's an amazing thing. We are the early years of the 1500s, and these men and women, they meet and to read and write poetry, to discuss. It's a sort of academy open to men and women, of course, of quite high social standing. We're always talking about elite people, but still is it's interesting. And this friendship, they last over Bembo's life. And one of the things that it's really fascinating is that Bembo he certainly had quite many love affairs, and it's hard to sometimes set the boundaries between love affair and friendship. There's a certain ambiguity. But one of the most amazing relationships he has with women is probably with the poet Veronica Gambara. She was also a noblewoman, and the correspondence covers decades. And there's a beautiful letter in which he writes, "We met when you were a young kid." Well, she might have been a teenager, more or less, and he was already a man. And then they remained friends throughout their lives. And in his late years, he was the great cardinal, and he was still writing letters to her, and they were still exchanging sonnets, and that's something that lasted until Bembo's death. And this is probably unique. I can't think of any other, probably there are, but I can't remember now. Men who has such strong, powerful relationship of friendship with women based on a reciprocal acknowledgement of their value as persons, as writers, and that's something that strikes me when I read Bembo.
Okay. Any more questions or comments from? Yeah.
My question has to do with the pervasiveness of the role of women who were regarded as courtesans in that period, and how it might still be relevant in terms of looking at women's roles today, not just in Italy necessarily, but in the world where information travels quickly. Particularly the economic piece. How are women in the role of courtesan, who are the educated, who represented an educated voice in that society, be relegated to such a role that is lower than that of wife or mother in a traditional sense in Renaissance pre-Italy?
Okay, so the point was that, chastity was considered in pre-modern societies the fundamental value for a woman. Because, in a society that had no paternity tests, the only way to ensure that the office, literally, was legitimate was for the woman to be chaste, right? So, there were estates that were very valuable, that were to be inherited only by legitimate heirs, and if there was no legitimate heir, then in some cases, the Montefeltro, etc., you can move on to illegitimate offspring. But the only way to ensure the social order, basically, and the legitimacy of offspring was for women to be chaste. So the one thing that a courtesan is not is chaste, right? Because they basically sell their body to men. So this is the reason for, the relatively low consideration of courtesans in society, despite their education, influence, etc. Now, there are also different questions to be taken into account. Some of them I just briefly hinted at during my talk, which is the courtesan as the symbol of a society where you could ascend real quick and fall really quickly from grace, because they often had these, incredible careers until their beauty lasted, and then they fall from grace. There are these satires against courtesans that depict, really have kind of a morbid interest in depicting their bodies as disfigured by syphilis. And because, syphilis was ravaging, in the early modern period. And therefore that was, taken as the symbol of the rapid fall of the courtesan, and also of the fate who could befell those who try to rise from a low, social standing to the higher social standing. So it was also a kind of metaphor of be careful if you want to climb the social ladder, right? Other reasons why the courtesan could have been disquieted were the ones that I mentioned. They resembled the fate of the courtier in the way that these people were, as I was mentioning, social climbers, and therefore they had to be, they were rivals for them. They had to be careful with what they did. So it's a kind of a very fascinating world that has been studied extensively, and it's kind of hard to pin down, what the main points were, but I think mostly for Renaissance society, the problem was, the lack of chastity. Something else, I'm sorry, that just comes to my mind that I wanted to mention was that in selling their bodies, basically the courtesan gave up their freedom. So I think, and this is, me, that there is a disquieting notion in both the courtier and the courtesan of a potential loss of identity, of individuality in a society which, according to traditional reading by, a scholar named Burkhardt, etc., the modern individual was born. So this idea of people who were selling themselves was kind of moving against that change in time period where, individuality and affirmation of oneself and what is called self-fashioning were becoming relevant. You know what I mean? I try to summarize very quickly something that is a very complex topic. Thank you.
And if I may add just a quick footnote, I think also courtesans were hard to place within the social order, and at the same time, because they were kind of attractive and beautiful, but also they had these illnesses that disfigured them and that one not could see. At some point, we see that they become the symbol, the metaphor of a word that is becoming very hard to decipher. In early modern Italy, at some point, reality really becomes difficult to understand because everything that happens, the Reformation, the Italian wars, let's say discovery of new words, everything that changes so rapidly, so quickly, the word becomes hard to understand. At some point, courtesans become, in a way, the embodiment of this reality, this opaque reality that people are no longer able to.
Where appearances can be a thing, but hiding under a splendid appearance that could be, exactly. A deadly disease.
Exactly, that kind of.
Yeah.
Another question. Please, can you wait for the microphone? Otherwise, they cannot hear us online.
Why were courtesans considered worthy of being educated?
Why were courtesans considered worthy of being educated? Well, education was more threatening in a wife and mother probably than in a courtesan. Exactly because, it's a complicated question. Yeah.
It was also a way for, as I was saying, people to climb the social ladder. So there's like a beautiful and very sad letter by Veronica Franco, who was probably the most famous Venetian courtesan, to a mother who is trying to make her daughter become a courtesan. And it's something like, people taking their children to reality shows or try to make them, to turn them into TikTok stars. I'm sorry for the metaphor, but you know what I mean? So it's not that we're considered worthy of being educated, like that kind of investment in having them play the lute, having them sing, they were beautiful. For people who wanted to climb the social ladder was like, placing your daughter as a courtesan or becoming a courtesan was really a way to achieve richness and fame. And this very beautiful but tragic letter from Veronica Franco to this mother who apparently is trying to have her daughter enter a career as a courtesan. She's very, Veronica Franco is very direct, kind of cold, but very realistic. She's like, well, your daughter is not that beautiful. She's not that talented. And I'm telling you, this is a very sad life. So be careful what you wish for your daughter.
And also, we are talking about a very refined society. So high status men needed to be entertained with refined art, music. They should be able to sing, to play a musical instrument, to write poetry. Exactly. That was the concept. The lady said it's almost like a geisha. Yeah, the concept is more or less the same. Yeah, they were not in brothels, right? They were in, yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's a completely different concept, a completely different social status. Oh, any more questions or comments? What about our online audience? They're silent. Okay, so I think it's time for a toast. And we have refreshments waiting for us in the courtyard, I guess. Okay, thank you so much, all of us, for being here.